The summer heat came down on Highway 395 like something with intent, like a living thing that had decided on that particular Tuesday in July to press its full weight against every surface it could find. The asphalt shimmered in the distance, turning the road ahead into a mirage of itself, a liquid ribbon of black that seemed to dissolve before it could be reached. Inside the cab of a 1998 Ford Explorer, with 212,000 miles on the odometer and a crack running the full length of the windshield, Loretta Haynes drove with both hands on the wheel and her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She was 42 years old and she looked every year of it that morning. Not in a way that spoke of neglect, but in a way that spoke of work, of carrying things. The fine lines at the corners of her eyes had deepened over the past 18 months into something more permanent, and there were threads of gray woven through her dark brown hair that she had stopped bothering to cover. She wore a faded blue cotton blouse with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and a pair of khaki shorts that had seen better summers. Her hands wrapped around the cracked steering wheel were the hands of a woman who had been gripping things tightly for a very long time and had not yet been given a reason to ease up. On the passenger seat beside her, riding with his chin resting on the center console and his warm brown eyes tracking her face with a slow, worried patience, was Banjo. He was 3 years old, a golden retriever mix with oversized paws he had never quite grown into, ears that flopped forward whenever he tilted his head, and a coat the color of warm honey in afternoon light. He weighed 70 pounds and carried himself with the gentle, stumbling affection of a dog who believed, with absolute certainty, that his only purpose on earth was to remain as close to Loretta as the laws of physics would allow. He whined softly now, a low sound from the back of his throat, and pressed his chin harder against the console until she could feel the weight of his head through the gear shift. "I know," Loretta said quietly. "I know, buddy." She did not elaborate because there was nothing more to say that would help either of them. The letter from Pacific Coast Federal was sitting in her purse on the back seat, folded into thirds, the way official correspondence always arrived, the kind that required precise creases because the news inside needed to be contained, somehow held together by paper and fold lines before it was allowed to exist in the open air. She had read it 3 times that morning at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her, each reading confirming the same thing the previous one had. Final notice of foreclosure. The house on Elm Street in Ridgecrest, the one she had bought with her ex-husband Derek 14 years ago, the one she had repainted herself room by room after he left, the one with the scuff marks on the kitchen door frame where she had measured Banjo's height as a puppy with a pencil and a quiet laugh that had belonged entirely to her, would cease to be hers in 31 days unless she could produce a sum of money she did not have and had no reasonable means of obtaining. Derek had left 22 months ago. He had left cleanly, the way men sometimes do when they have been planning it for longer than anyone knew, taking the checking account and the truck, and it turned out roughly 2/3 of the shared financial reality Loretta had believed was solid ground beneath her feet. The divorce had been final for 14 months. It had cost her everything the marriage had not already taken. Her credit score now lived in a range that made bank loan officers look at their computer screens instead of at her face when she sat across from them. Her job as a court clerk for Kern County had been eliminated in a round of budget cuts 6 weeks ago, a position she had held for 9 years, a position she had been genuinely good at, a fact that turned out to be entirely beside the point when the county needed to balance its numbers. She had $43 in her checking account. She had a little more than half a tank of gas. She had a dog who loved her without condition or complication or any awareness of her financial situation. And she was driving on Highway 395 on a Tuesday in July with no particular destination and eyes that kept blurring in a way she was working hard to prevent. She needed to stop. Not in the large permanent sense, though. Some part of her understood that version of the thought was also present. But in the immediate practical sense, she needed to pull off the highway and sit still for 5 minutes and drink something cold and let the tightness in her chest ease enough to breathe properly and remind herself that she was still a functional adult who was capable of handling the next 31 days. Even if handling them was going to require a definition of the word she had not previously needed to use. The sign materialized on the right shoulder of the highway, a sun-bleached rectangle on a rusted post advertising fuel in a general store. Oakhurst Fuel and Supply. The gravel lot that came into view as she slowed was rough and uneven, bordered on three sides by ponderosa pines that threw ragged, incomplete shade across the ground. There was a small cinder block building with a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising cold drinks and live bait, and an ice machine mounted against the outside wall that hummed with mechanical persistence against the heat. Loretta put on her turn signal and eased off the highway, the Explorer's worn tires crunching over loose gravel as she pulled in and looked for a place to park. She did not see the motorcycles until she was already committed to her line of travel and moving toward them. They were parked along the far edge of the lot in a row so precise it had the quality of ceremony of something deliberate and considered. 12 of them arranged with a symmetry that communicated something well beyond mere parking preference. They were Harley-Davidsons, every one of them, and they were not the showroom variety that weekend riders kept in climate-controlled garages and trailered to rallies. These were machines that had been lived in and worked on and altered over years and miles until they expressed something very specific about the people who owned them and rode them. Custom matte paint in deep reds and flat blacks that ate the sunlight rather than reflecting it. Chrome polished to a sharpness that caught the afternoon glare and threw it back hard. Extended forks, fat rear tires. Handlebars wrapped in black leather that had taken on the particular shape of the hands that gripped them 10,000 miles at a time. And draped across the handlebars of the largest bike, the one positioned at the head of the row, a candy apple red chopper with forks stretched long and low, and a gas tank hand-painted with detail work that was visible even from 30 feet away was a leather vest. It hung there with the casual authority of a flag planted on claimed territory. On its back, stitched in red and white thread that had been worked with patient, careful hands that knew what they were making, was a winged death's head above a bottom rocker that read in stark block letters, Iron Wolves Central Valley. Loretta's foot moved toward the brake pedal. What happened in the next 2 seconds rearranged everything that came after, and there was nothing in those 2 seconds she could have done differently that she did not attempt. Her sandal, cheap, rubber-soled with a strap that had been loose for the better part of 3 weeks, and that she had been meaning to replace, caught on the raised edge of the floor mat at the exact moment her foot was transferring from accelerator to brake. The rubber sole snagged and held. Her foot pulled against it instinctively and found not the brake pedal, but the accelerator. And it found it with full unintended weight in the Ford Explorer. All 4,000 pounds of aging American steel lurched forward with a roar that sounded almost purposeful, almost like the machine had been waiting for permission to do exactly this. Time did what time always does in the worst moments of a person's life. It stretched itself into something slow and merciless and completely transparent, showing her everything she was about to do and giving her no mechanism to prevent it. The candy apple red chopper filled the windshield. She stamped both feet down in a blind and panicked search for the brake pedal and found it a half second after it no longer mattered. The front bumper of the Explorer caught the chopper at its midsection with a sound that was less a crash than a detonation, a single sharp report that bounced off the tree line and came back as an echo. Metal shrieked against metal. Fiberglass shattered in a spray of pieces that caught the afternoon sun like broken jewelry scattered across the gravel. The chopper went over sideways, its full weight carrying it into the black bagger parked to its left, which went over into the touring bike beside it, and the domino effect moved down the row with a horrible oiled inevitability, each machine taking the next one down until 3 motorcycles lay on their sides on the gravel of the parking lot. Gasoline spreading in dark and widening halos from their tanks. Chrome scattered like debris from something that had exploded rather than simply fallen. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It was absolute. Even the ice machine seemed to stop. Then the bell above the gas station door chimed once, and 5 men came out into the white afternoon sunlight. They emerged as a loose group and then stopped together, taking in the scene with the practiced stillness of people who had learned long ago that the first several seconds after something goes badly wrong are best spent observing before acting. They were large men, each of them carrying the physical density of people who have spent their lives doing demanding things in demanding conditions, in service of a life that does not offer much accommodation to softness. They wore leather cuts over plain t-shirts and flannels, the same winged death's head patch on every back. Their faces a collection of scars and ink and weathered expression that told stories in a language Loretta did not speak, but could read the general import of without any translation. The one who stopped most completely, who went most still, was the one in the center. He stood with his weight settled back on his heels and his arms loose at his sides, a posture that looked like calm and was something else entirely. He looked at the three motorcycles lying in the gravel and the spreading gasoline, and then he looked at the Ford Explorer, and then he found Loretta's face through the windshield, and his eyes locked onto hers with an expression that was not yet rage, but was the compressed material that rage is constructed from the thing that lives directly beneath it and feeds it, still choosing in those first seconds whether to become fully what it was. His name was Rex Dolan. He was the sergeant-at-arms of the Iron Wolves Central Valley Charter. He was a large man with a jaw that carried a pale scar running from its corner to his left ear, and eyes the color of a winter sky over the Sierra Nevada, and the candy apple red chopper currently lying on its side in a pool of its own leaking fuel was the most important object remaining in his world. Not for reasons that had anything to do with money, but for reasons that had everything to do with a man named Eddie, who had been dead for 3 years, and whom Rex had been trying imperfectly and without great success to keep close to through the only physical thing Eddie had left behind. Inside the Explorer, chaos arrived without announcement. Banjo had been riding with his head out the half-open passenger window, the way he always did on highway stretches, ears streaming back in the slipstream nose, working the passing world. The crash, the shrieking metal, and the shattering fiberglass, and the sudden eruption of male voices outside detonated something ancient and non-negotiable in him. He scrambled backward across the seat, then forward, then in a single motion that happened faster than Loretta's eye could follow. He twisted his 70-pound body through the half-open window with the boneless, total desperation of pure animal terror and dropped to the gravel 4 feet below. Banjo, no. She threw her door open and was halfway out of the seat, 1 foot already on the running board, when something stopped her with the completeness of a wall. A hand large and calloused came flat against the door and shoved it back, and she was suddenly pinned between the open door and the doorframe with no room to move, and Rex Dolan was standing over her close enough that she could see the specific texture of the scar along his jaw, close enough to smell the road and the leather and the particular exhaustion that accumulates in a person who has been driving long distances in summer heat. His gray eyes were very direct and very cold. "Do you have any earthly idea?" Rex said, his voice a low and controlled thing that carried more weight than shouting would have. "What you just did to my lot." "I'm sorry." The words fractured as they came out, broken up by the shaking that had taken over her entire body without her permission. "My sandal caught on the mat. My foot slipped. I couldn't find the brake in time. Please, my dog just ran into the trees. I need to find him before he gets lost. He'll go deeper if I don't." "I don't have any concern about your dog right now." The words landed flat and without inflection and entirely final. Behind Rex, the wiry one with the snake tattoo that wound up his neck from collarbone to jaw, the one the others would later call Cutter, had crouched beside the fallen machines and was lifting pieces of shattered chrome and setting them down again with the focused, furious attention of a man cataloging damage he has not yet decided the full cost of. "You just put $30,000 worth of custom fabricated steel on the ground," Rex said. His voice had still not risen. "That's the replacement value. That doesn't begin to cover the custom work. It doesn't cover the tank art. It doesn't cover things that don't have a number attached to them. I have insurance." She heard herself say it and heard simultaneously how insufficient it was going to be. "Full coverage. I have full coverage on this vehicle. Please, he's going to run further in if I don't go after him right now. Please just let me license." The single word closed the conversation like a door. She reached into the Explorer with hands that were trembling badly enough to make the simple task of opening her purse difficult. She dropped it once onto the floor of the car, retrieved it, dropped her wallet, getting it out, finally extracted her driver's license and held it toward him. Rex took it, looked at it, then produced a phone from his vest pocket and photographed both sides with two quick and unhurried snaps. He handed it back without looking at her. Loretta Haynes, he said, reading from the image on his screen. Elm Street Ridgecrest. He put the phone away with the deliberateness of a man who has done what he came outside to do. Your insurance carrier is not going to touch custom fabrication work. You are looking at $10,000 in damages at the floor. We don't structure payment plans. I don't have it. The truth of it came out of her raw and immediate without the buffer she might have tried to maintain in any other circumstances. I don't have anything approaching it. I got a final foreclosure notice in my mail this morning. I have $43 in my bank account, and I'm going to lose my house in a month. She looked past him toward the tree line, the specific gap between two ponderosa pines where she had last seen Banjo's honey-colored coat disappearing into shadow already gone. Please, without him, I don't know what I'm holding on to. That's the honest truth of it. Something moved across Rex Dolan's face when she said that. It was quick and private, and she could not have named it or held on to it because his jaw had already reset into its hard line before she had time to fully register what she had seen. Move the vehicle out of my lot, he said. He looked at Cutter, who had come to stand at his shoulder. Get me a full damage assessment before end of day. Photos of everything. Cutter's right hand had dropped to the handle of the hunting knife on his belt, resting there without gripping the way a man rests his hand on a familiar object when he is thinking about what to do next. He was looking at Loretta with a flat and measuring expression. You sure we just let her pull out of here? I said move the vehicle. Rex did not look at Cutter. He kept his eyes on Loretta. You'll be hearing from us about the debt, Ms. Haynes. Drive safe. She stood at the edge of the tree line for the better part of an hour, calling Banjo's name in every register she could produce from the sharp command she used when he was getting into something to the low coaxing voice she used at the end of long days when she just needed him to come and lie beside her. She walked 20 feet into the pines, then 30, moving through the dappled shadow in the dry manzanita scrub, stopping to listen between calls. The jays answered her. The highway answered her. The forest gave her nothing back. A dog could lose his bearings in that terrain in 5 minutes. Could be 200 yards in any direction and invisible behind the dense growth. She knew this, and she knew that calling into the middle distance was not a rescue plan. It was a gesture, and she made it anyway because stopping felt like abandonment, and she had already committed one act today that she was going to have to live with. When voices from the lot reached her low and deliberate and aimed in her direction, she understood her window had closed. She walked back to the Explorer. She sat behind the wheel with Banjo's leash still coiled on the passenger seat, still carrying the warmth of his body from where he had been lying on it, and she looked at the tree line through the windshield for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. She had left her dog in the wilderness because staying would have been worse. That was the fact of it, and she was not able to arrange it into a shape that looked like anything other than what it was. She pulled out of the lot and back onto the highway, and she watched the tree line in her rearview mirror until the curve of the road took it from her. The Ridgecrest Sheriff's Department occupied a squat beige building on a side street 2 blocks off the main commercial strip, and Sheriff Dale Maddox had been running it for going on 3 decades. He was a lean man of 61, with close-cropped silver hair and a deliberate manner that had once read primarily as steadiness, and now sitting across from Loretta at his desk with a cup of coffee growing cold beside his keyboard, read as something more complicated and more tired. He looked at the photograph she had taken from the far side of the lot. Her phone held low and angled the lens, barely clearing the door frame of the Explorer. 3 motorcycles down in the gravel, chrome scattered, the Iron Wolves patch visible on the cuts of 2 of the men standing near the fallen machines. He set her phone on the desk between them. He leaned back in his chair. He looked at the window behind her for a moment before he looked at her face. Loretta, he said, I'm going to be straight with you because I think that serves you better right now than anything softer would. Please. Rex Dolan is not a man who responds proportionately to being cost money. Maddox turned a pen slowly between 2 fingers, end over end. The Iron Wolves have distribution infrastructure running from Ridgecrest all the way up to Bakersfield. Methamphetamine primarily, stolen vehicle parts. Some other things we have ongoing suspicions about and insufficient evidence to move on. They have burned a man's commercial garage to the concrete slab over a debt considerably smaller than what you're describing. He paused and let that sit. There is a meaningful distance between the department having an active file on these individuals and the department being in a position to provide a private citizen 24-hour protection at a residential address. I can put a patrol car past your house twice each night, possibly 3 times if the shift coverage allows. That's everything you can do. That's everything I can do. He said it with the specific worn quality of a man who has been delivering honest and inadequate answers to people for 30 years and has not discovered a way to make them land differently. I am genuinely sorry. If they make direct contact, call 911 immediately. But I want you to understand clearly that if Rex Dolan has decided to make a serious example of someone, a patrol car on your street at midnight is not going to alter that outcome. Loretta drove home through the white, buzzing interior silence of someone who has just been told the thing they already suspected was true and had been hoping was wrong. The house on Elm Street was a single-story ranch with a detached garage and a backyard enclosed in chain-link fencing, one of the smaller properties on the block, which had always suited her. She had put a rose bush in along the front walk 3 springs back. She had repainted the porch railing herself the previous October, in a color she had chosen alone without consultation, because it reminded her of the inside of an abalone shell she had found on a beach in Morro Bay when she was 9 years old. It was the only element of the house she had selected entirely on her own terms, and she had felt a small and reliable satisfaction about it every time she came home. She locked the deadbolt, then the security chain. Then she moved the heavy oak armchair from the living room into the entryway and wedged it under the door handle, which she understood was not a meaningful security measure against the people she was thinking about, but which her hands needed to do regardless of what her head knew. She pulled every curtain in the house. She turned off the porch light and the lamp in the front window that she normally left on. She did not eat dinner. She sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the lower cabinet doors and Banjo's empty food bowl in her lap, turning it in her hands, and she called Derek. She listened to his voice for 15 seconds before he recognized what kind of trouble she was calling about and ended the call without a word of explanation. She called 2 banks about emergency personal loans and listened to loan officers deliver their scripted regret while looking at a credit score that had made the decision before she finished her first sentence. She called a 3rd bank and did not finish the application question before she understood what the answer was going to be and stopped asking. She placed her phone face down on the kitchen tile and sat in the dark with the empty food bowl, and she let herself feel the full weight of the day. All of it, the foreclosure notice and the crash and the debt. She could not pay and the dog she had left in the wilderness, and she did not try to manage it into something more bearable because she was too tired for that kind of management and because some things deserve to be felt at their actual size. The first night was quiet, which was in some ways more difficult than noise would have been. The quiet had a quality to it, a texture, the particular stillness of something that is holding itself still rather than simply being still. She slept in the hallway in her sleeping bag, positioned closest to the front door, with the baseball bat from the garage lying beside her. And what she did was not exactly sleeping, but a series of brief losses of consciousness between long stretches of lying in the dark, cataloging sounds. On the morning of the second day, she stood in the kitchen making coffee and reached automatically for Banjo's bowl to fill it before she remembered. The bowl was where she had left it last night in her lap on the kitchen floor. She stood with the water running over her hand into the sink for a moment, and then she turned off the tap and picked up her phone and called the hardware store on 5th Street. They had fluorescent pink poster board. She bought 8 sheets. She drove back toward the area of the crash in the dark that second night, taking a route that kept the gas station itself out of her path, moving quickly through the pools of streetlight, taping the neon pink posters to telephone poles and the community board outside the Oakhurst General Store and the bulletin board in the Pine Street laundromat. The poster said, "Missing golden retriever mix male 3 years. Answers to banjo. Large reward." She had written her cell number in large black marker strokes. She had no reward to offer. The word was a lie, and she wrote it without hesitation because the lie was necessary and because the people who would read those posters and consider calling were not going to call for $43. On her way back to the car, she passed close to the gravel lot of the gas station, not entering it, staying on the highway shoulder. She stopped at the place where the gravel met the asphalt, and she looked at the tree line. She found the gap between the two ponderosa pines where she had last seen Banjo disappear, identified it by the angle and by the broken lower branch on the left-hand tree. And she stood there memorizing it before she took out her phone and opened the Maps application and dropped a location pin. She labeled it B Last Seen. She stood there a moment longer with the warm night air moving around her, looking at the dark gap between the trees and thinking about what was on the other side of it. And then she got back in the Explorer and drove home. The second day passed in a long, suspended quiet. She checked her phone for missed calls every 20 minutes. None came. On the evening of the second day, at approximately 9 o'clock, a blacked-out pickup truck appeared at the entrance of her cul-de-sac. It did not turn in. It idled at the mouth of the street with its headlights on, aimed at the houses, and the light came through the gaps in her closed blinds and through long bars of pale yellow across the living room wall. Loretta sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the refrigerator and the baseball bat across her knees, and she watched the light on the wall, and she breathed, and she did not call 911 because she understood what would happen when the patrol car arrived and then left again. The truck did not accelerate away when it finally moved. It crept past her driveway at a pace that seemed to have been chosen specifically slowly enough to register as a statement rather than a departure, and then it was gone, and the cul-de-sac was dark and quiet again. She sat with the bat in her hands in the kitchen in darkness until past 2 in the morning. Somewhere around midnight, while the house was at its most silent, she heard something from outside that she could not immediately place. Not the truck, something different. Voices low and brief on the street side of the house. 2 voices, possibly 3, and they were not raised, which somehow made them more unsettling than raised voices would have been. She pressed herself against the wall beside the front window without moving the curtain, and she listened. But the voices stopped before she could determine direction or distance, and the street returned to its nighttime quiet as though the sound had not occurred. She thought about it afterward. She did not know what to make of it. On the morning of the third day, she opened the front door to retrieve her newspaper, and there was something on the welcome mat that was not her newspaper. It was a piece of chrome, a fragment of a side mirror, she thought, or what remained of one, twisted and compressed by force into a shape that still held the memory of what it had been before impact. It was a piece of the candy apple red chopper, and she knew it with the immediate and sickening certainty of a person recognizing something they had been trying not to think about. There was no note. Notes were unnecessary when the message was this clear and this specific: "We have been here at your door while you slept. You are not in a place where locks protect you." She stepped back inside and pulled the door closed and locked it, and stood in her hallway with one hand pressed flat against the wood and her forehead almost touching its surface. And she stood there until her breathing returned to something that could be called normal. On the afternoon of the third day, after sitting with the locked doors and the closed curtains for most of the morning, she made a decision. She put her pepper spray in her jacket pocket and her small emergency flashlight in her other pocket, and she drove to the trailhead off Highway 395, and she walked into the forest calling Banjo's name. She told herself she was checking to see if any of the posters had been moved or taken down. She told herself she was maintaining the search effort. Both of these things were true, and neither of them was the real reason she was in the trees alone on the third afternoon, which was that she could not sit in the closed house any longer without doing something. And this was the only something she could think of that had any connection to the problem she actually cared most about solving. She walked the trail for 100 yards until it dissolved into dry manzanita and fallen pine duff. And then she went off it, pushing through the brush in the general direction of the location pin she had dropped 2 nights before. The ground sloped as she went a long, gradual decline that steepened as the undergrowth thinned, and after 20 minutes of pushing through dense growth, she came to a place where the ground simply stopped. The ravine cut into the hillside as though something enormous had dragged a finger through the earth. It was deep, 40 feet at minimum, with walls of crumbling, decomposed granite and exposed root systems, and it was choked at the bottom with wild blackberry canes that had taken over what had once been a seasonal creek bed, and threading through the blackberry and rusted broken loops was old barbed wire fencing, the remnant of some grazing operation that had been abandoned long enough ago that the wire had become part of the landscape. Loretta stood at the edge of the ravine and looked down. The late afternoon light reached the bottom at a steep angle, illuminating the White Creek rocks and the rust-dark wire and the dense tangle of thorn canes. She called Banjo's name. The ravine gave her back the echo of her own voice, and nothing else. She stood there for a long time looking down into it. Then she looked at the light filtering through the pines and understood that she had perhaps 20 minutes before the forest went too dark to navigate safely back to the road, and that going down into a 40-foot ravine with loose walls alone, in failing light without rope or anchor equipment, was the kind of decision from which there might not be a return. She took out her phone. She opened the Maps application and dropped a second pin at the ravine's edge. She labeled it Ravine Check Here. Then she took 6 photographs of the location from different angles, noting the specific shape of the ravine's edge, the old fencing that marked where the drop began, the angle of the 2 tallest pines that could serve as landmarks from the road. She worked her way back toward the highway, snapping branches at waist height as she went to mark the path so she could find it again quickly. She drove home in the last of the daylight with her hands steady on the wheel and her jaw set in the way that her face set itself when she had made a decision she was not going to revisit. Tomorrow she would come back with rope. She would find a way to anchor it. She would get down there. She did not know how to rappel, and she had not done anything like it before, but these were solvable problems if she thought about them methodically, and she intended to think about them methodically, and she intended to go back in. That was the state of things on the 4th evening when the sound began. She was in the kitchen with a glass of water she had not drunk when she felt it. Before she heard it, a low mechanical vibration that came up through the floorboards and trembled the surface of the water in the glass and moved into her feet and legs, like a frequency the body recognizes from somewhere evolutionary. It deepened as it approached her street, separating itself from the background noise of the neighborhood into something unmistakable, the layered, overlapping thunder of many large displacement engines moving together at low speed, each one distinct and together creating something that had physical mass that pressed against the windows of the house. Loretta set the glass down. She crossed to the front window. She moved the edge of the blind back with one finger, creating a gap perhaps 2 inches wide, and she put her eye to it. 20 Harley-Davidsons were turning onto Elm Street in 2 columns, their headlights burning in the dusky amber of early evening, their engines filling the street with sound and the smell of exhaust that reached her even through the closed window. They moved at the pace of a procession. The neighbors who had been out in their yards came in. She watched a woman 2 houses down take her daughter by the hand and move toward the front door without looking toward the street. She watched porch lights click off one by one as the motorcycles passed. Within 90 seconds, the cul-de-sac, which had been alive with the ordinary sounds of a summer evening, had become completely still and abandoned, as though a signal had been sent that everyone received except her. The motorcycles slowed as they reached her property. They pulled to the curb and onto the grass strip between the sidewalk and the road in a formation that curved in front of her driveway like a crescent, like a wall, like something that had been thought about in advance. The engines cut off. Not simultaneously, one by one in sequence, each going silent until the last one died, and the silence that followed was the densest and most absolute thing she had experienced in 4 days of difficult silences. Loretta stepped back from the window. Her chest was tight in the specific physical way of a body that has made its own assessment of the situation and is not waiting for the mind to catch up. She pressed her back against the wall and tried the breathing exercise she had read about in some forgotten magazine. 4 counts in, 4 counts held 4 counts out. It did not substantially help. It did not. She found her phone and called 911. The call connected for 2 rings, and then the signal, which had been marginal all week in this part of the neighborhood, dropped entirely, and she was standing in her entryway with a dead call and the unmistakable sound of heavy boots on the gravel of her front walk coming toward her door. She went to the entryway. She picked up the baseball bat. She held it at her side in both hands, not raised but present, and she stood in her hallway and she waited. The knock, when it came, was not a knock in any ordinary sense of the word. It was 3 heavy strikes against the door that she felt in her sternum, each one a statement rather than a request. Loretta Haynes. Rex Dolan's voice came through the wood, controlled and carrying and completely certain of itself. Open the door. She stood in the hallway. Her hands were tight on the bat. Her feet were not moving. We know you're inside, Loretta. The voice was quieter on the second approach, which was somehow worse than the first. The rage she had heard at the gas station had been replaced by something that had more mass to it, a calm that was not the absence of force, but force held in reserve. You can open this door, or we'll open it for you. Those are the 2 choices available right now. She was cornered. The backyard chain-link fence was 5 feet high and backed against an alley, and she had seen enough of these men in the past 4 days to understand with clarity that a 5-foot fence and 30 feet of open yard would not constitute a meaningful obstacle for them. There was no other door. There was no version of this that did not involve her front door opening. She was not going to be found hiding in her own hallway. She put her hand on the deadbolt. She turned it. The click it made was the loudest sound she had heard all week. She took one breath and pulled the door open. The evening air came in first warm and carrying the smells of gasoline and hot engine metal and old leather and the distance those men had traveled. And then she was looking at Rex Dolan, and behind and around him, spread across her porch and down her front walk, and filling what had been her ordinary front lawn, were 20 men in Iron Wolf's cuts, every one of them looking at her. Rex Dolan's gray eyes moved to the baseball bat at her side. He looked at it for a moment with an expression that was not contempt, but was not entirely without it. You can set that down, he said. His voice was quieter than it had been through the door. If harm was the purpose of this visit, that piece of wood would not be a meaningful factor in the outcome. Loretta did not set it down. Her knuckles remained white on the handle. She met his eyes and she held them, and she did not look away, and she did not step back. And something moved through Rex Dolan's expression that was private and rapid, and might, under a completely different set of circumstances, have been something close to respect. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he raised one hand in a slow, deliberate signal directed at the men behind him. Bring him up, he said. The crowd of men divided. It happened without instruction, without any visible coordination. The way a body of water divides around an obstacle, the group simply opening along an invisible seam from Rex Dolan's right side all the way back to the street until there was a clear corridor of leather and denim and road-worn men stretching from the porch to the curb, and moving up that corridor, walking with a care and a deliberateness that were entirely at odds with the rest of his bearing, came Cutter. He was not holding his knife. He was not swaggering with the loose confidence she had watched him carry in the gas station lot. Both of his arms were occupied, folded around something large and heavy that had been wrapped in a faded denim vest, of the kind a man pulls off his own back when something more urgent requires covering, and the bundle shifted against his chest with the slow, labored movements of something that was alive but had been expending its reserves for a long time and was running low. Loretta's mind went immediately to the worst interpretations. That was what 4 days of sustained fear did to a person's imagination. It populated every unknown with whatever darkness happened to be most readily available, and the darkness she had been living with was not in short supply. She felt herself flinching away from the thought before it fully assembled. Then the bundle shifted again, and a sound came from inside the denim. A whimper, soft and high and exhausted in the specific way of something that has been making sounds for a very long time into a silence that did not answer and has nearly given up expecting it to. And a single floppy golden ear dropped free from the fold of the vest and hung in the evening air. The baseball bat hit the porch floor. She did not make the decision to let it go. Her hand simply opened and it fell, and she was already moving. She went to her knees on the threshold of her own front door, not with any grace or deliberateness, but in the complete and immediate way of a body that has just had every tension leave it at once. Cutter was already crouching opposite her, and he lowered his bundle with a gentleness that was so completely at odds with everything else about him that she knew she would think about it afterward, in the quiet, and still not quite be able to fully reconcile it with the man she had seen at the gas station, with his hand resting on his hunting knife. Banjo came to rest on the boards of her front porch. He was nearly unrecognizable. His coat, that warm honey gold she knew as well as she knew her own hands, was matted flat with dried mud and caked with burrs and thorns, and the accumulated debris of 3 days of pressing through dense mountain brush. There was blood dried to a rust color in the fur of his left shoulder and down his foreleg. His rib cage rose and fell in a shallow and effortful rhythm that was too fast and too shallow. His eyes were at half-mast, the warm brown of them gone dull and distant, the eyes of an animal that has been making calculations about whether it is worth continuing. But his nose still worked. Even in that condition, his nose found her scent in the air of the porch and processed it and sent the message down whatever channel connects a dog's nose to the rest of what a dog is. She watched it happen. She watched the nostrils flare and the ears try to rise, and the tail, which had been tucked flat against his body, give 3 slow and separate thumps against the wooden porch boards. She made a sound she would not have been able to describe or reproduce. She pulled his head into her lap and put her face down into the ruined wreckage of his neck, and she held on with both hands. Rex Dolan stood above them and was quiet for a moment. He looked at the woman on the floor of her porch and the dog in her arms, and then he looked out at the street where the neighborhood had gone dark and still and private behind its closed doors, and his face held the expression of a man doing arithmetic that is private and does not need an audience. "He needs attention," Rex said. The commanding edge in his voice had stepped back. "Gage." A large figure came forward from somewhere in the middle of the group. Gage was not the tallest of the Iron Wolves, but was built with a density that suggested considerable structural engineering, with a braided dark beard that reached his collarbone and hands that had the size and look of tools designed for work that required more force than most situations called for. He was carrying a hard-sided plastic case in olive green with metal latches, a serious first aid kit of the kind kept in the back of emergency vehicles and carried by people who had learned through experience to have one close. He moved with a stillness that felt professional. "Inside is better," Gage said. He looked at Loretta with an expression that was against all reasonable expectation patient. "He's lost blood. I need good light and a surface I can work on." Loretta looked up from the floor. She looked at Gage and then at Rex, and then at the 20 men arranged across her lawn in the settling dusk. And she made the only calculation her situation permitted, which was that she was in no position to refuse anything, and that beyond that calculation, there was something in her that did not want to refuse. "Come in," she said. What followed was one of the stranger things in Loretta Haynes's 42 years of living. In the past several weeks had not been short of strange things. 5 members of the Iron Wolves Central Valley Charter stood in her living room among the floral throw pillows on the sofa, and the collection of ceramic birds she had assembled over 15 years on the shelf beside the window, and the framed photograph of Banjo as a 12-week-old puppy asleep on a folded towel. And they occupied her domestic space with the specific self-consciousness of large men in small rooms who are concentrating on not knocking anything over. Gage knelt on her faded Persian rug with the first aid kit open and organized on the floor beside him. He had surgical scissors iodine solution in a brown bottle, a needle already threaded with suture material, and several small amber vials, whose labels Loretta chose not to try to read. He worked on Banjo's injured leg with a focus that admitted no distraction, pausing each time the dog flinched to press one enormous and grease-darkened thumb gently into the space between Banjo's eyes and speak to him in a register so low it was more vibration than voice. And whatever he was doing, it worked, because Banjo would ease back into stillness after a moment. Loretta sat cross-legged on the rug beside her dog and fed him small pieces of the boiled chicken she kept prepared in the refrigerator because Banjo's digestion was sensitive and the kibble alone sometimes wasn't sufficient. He took each piece from her fingers with a deliberate care, as though eating required his complete attention, and between pieces, he pressed his nose into her palm and breathed against her skin. Rex stood at the front window with one hand on the curtain frame, looking out at the street where the rest of his men waited along the curb. The sound of their voices was a low, continuous murmur underneath the domestic sounds of the house. The silence inside went on for a while before Loretta broke it. "Tell me how you found him," she said. She was watching Gage's hands, not looking at Rex. "Please." Rex let the curtain fall. He turned from the window and crossed to the armchair across from the sofa and sat down in it, the leather of his cut creaking against the upholstery. He was quiet for a moment in the deliberate way of a man deciding where in a story to begin. "We had business at the Hills this morning," he said. "One of our members, Daryl Pruitt, had his motorcycle stolen from his driveway 3 weeks ago. We received information that some individuals operating out of a camp on the old logging road on the east side of the ridge had been stripping stolen bikes and selling the components. We went up to address the situation." "Did you find them?" "The camp was abandoned when we arrived. They had either been tipped off or they moved on to another location. It doesn't bear on the rest of this." He shifted in the chair. "We were covering the tree line on the route back to the road, checking the access trails. One of my men heard something from the ravine that runs along the east face of the ridge." Loretta's hands went still on Banjo's back. "The sound was low enough that the first interpretation was a coyote," Rex continued. "Coyotes make sounds in that terrain that carry differently than you'd expect. But after listening for a moment, the quality was wrong. This was something that had been making the same sound for a long time, something running out of the energy to keep making it." He paused. "Gage worked the edge of the ravine until he had a sighting, about 40 feet down, tangled in old barbed wire and wild blackberry at the bottom was your dog." Loretta pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth. "He'd gone over the edge," Rex said. "Most likely in pursuit of something. A rabbit or a squirrel lost his footing in the brush at the rim and went down. The old wire caught him at the bottom. Every time he moved to pull free, the wire found a new purchase in his shoulder and his paw. He had been down there 3 days, severely dehydrated, no food. His core temperature was running too low for a July afternoon." Rex looked at Gage's hands for a moment. He had stopped fighting the wire. He was just lying there when Gage spotted him. Loretta closed her eyes. She felt Banjo's ribs expand and contract beneath her hand. She kept her hand there. "Getting him out took close to 3 hours, Rex said. "We ran 2 tow chains end to end from Daryl's rear axle to get enough length to reach the bottom and still have working slack. Cutter and Gage went down on rappel with bolt cutters. The dog snapped at both of them through the whole operation because he was terrified and had no way to understand what they were doing. Cutter has bite marks on his left forearm. Gage nearly lost the end of his index finger." He glanced at Cutter, who was in the kitchen doorway, his forearm resting against the frame, the marks on his skin visible even from across the room. When they finally had him cut free and wrapped in a vest and ready to haul up, he stopped fighting. He just went still and let them bring him up. The room was quiet except for the sounds of Gage working and Banjo breathing. "The pink posters," Rex said. "We passed several of them on the road in from the logging road. When we got a clear look at the dog once he was up and out of the ravine, the identification was not difficult." Loretta kept her eyes on Banjo. She was working against the pressure building at the back of her throat, the kind that precedes a specific kind of crying she did not intend to do in front of these men. She held it back. She managed. "I need to ask you something," she said. Rex waited. "The chrome on my welcome mat," she said. She looked up at him now. "The piece from the motorcycle, 3 days ago. I found it on my porch, and I understood it as a message. That you knew exactly where I slept, and that I wasn't safe even behind my own door." She held his gaze. "I've been living with that interpretation for 3 days. Rex did not answer immediately. He looked at Cutter in the doorway, and the exchange that passed between them contained an entire conversation conducted without words. Cutter straightened from the doorframe. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. The expression that crossed his angular features was one that required some adjustment to believe it could exist there, but it was unmistakably sheepish. "That was on me," Cutter said. "Tell me." "Rex sent me to check your address that first night. Verify you hadn't packed up and driven out of the area before we had a chance to work out the money situation." He cleared his throat. "I had the mirror piece in my jacket pocket. Took it from the crash site to show the guys at the clubhouse. Give them a sense of what the damage actually looked like." He paused. "When I got to your house, I walked up to the window to check whether the lights were on, whether the furniture was still in place. There was a dog barking down the block close and sudden, and I thought it might be a patrol car on the street. I moved fast. The mirror piece fell out of my pocket when I went over the porch step." He looked briefly at the floor. "I didn't notice until I was back at my bike. I came back for it and saw your lights come on inside. I left." "It was not a threat," Cutter said. "It was just me being careless." Loretta looked at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in her face, moving from the eyes downward, and the sound that came out of her was so startling and so completely discontinuous with the 4 days that had preceded it that it took her a full second to recognize it as laughter. Not the uncomplicated kind. The kind that has been compressed under great pressure and escapes sideways when a seam finally gives. She pressed her hand over her mouth. The laughter subsided. She shook her head once slowly. "4 days," she said. "4 days I was certain I was living on borrowed time." Cutter had the decency to look genuinely sorry. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's on me. I'm sorry about it." Rex Dolan watched this exchange without expression, but something in the way he held himself had shifted some load he had been carrying, had been set down quietly, and he leaned back in the armchair with the look of a man who has been maintaining a particular posture for a long time and has just been given a reason to release it. Gage tied off the last suture with a precise and practiced motion and sat back on his heels. He produced a small syringe from the kit, drew from one of the amber vials with unhurried efficiency, and administered the injection to the loose skin at the back of Banjo's neck, with a movement so quick and certain that Banjo registered it only after it was already done. Gage placed one large hand on the dog's back and held it there for a moment. "Penicillin," he said for Loretta's benefit. "Sufficient to hold off infection until you can get him to a veterinarian. Keep him off the leg for 2 weeks. Keep the wound clean and covered, and watch for any heat or discharge. He'll be running in a month." He looked at Banjo, who had his chin on Loretta's knee and his eyes half closed in the specific way of an animal that has made a final reassessment of its situation and found it satisfactory. 3 days in terrain like that on barbed wire and no water. That's not an ordinary animal. "No," Loretta said softly. "He's not ordinary at all." Rex stood. The movement reorganized the room's attention. "There's something I'm going to tell you," Rex said. He remained standing. His voice had gone to a different register than any she had heard from him, quieter, but carrying more weight the way a voice sounds when what it's saying is costing something to say. "You've asked in different ways why. I want to give you the actual answer." Loretta looked up at him. "That red chopper." Rex's eyes went to the window, to the darkness outside, to something that was not visible in the room. "Eddie built it. My older brother. He spent 5 years sourcing the components, fabricating the custom work, the extended forks, and the tank art, and every piece of chrome on that machine. Everything on it had his hands on it and his decisions in it. It was the most complete thing he ever made." He stopped, took a breath, let it go. "Eddie died 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Diagnosis to the end was 5 months and 2 weeks. That bike was the last physical object he made that still existed in the world. When I wrote it, it was the closest thing I had to him, still being somewhere in reach." He looked back at her. "When you hit it, I didn't experience a damaged motorcycle. I experienced my brother dying a second time in front of me in a gas station parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon." Loretta said nothing. There was no adequate response, and she had enough respect for what he had just said not to reach for an inadequate one. So when we found your dog in that ravine this morning, Rex said, still alive after 3 days, still fighting, still trying to get back to something, there was a specific reason why I made the decision to come here tonight instead of waiting until tomorrow. He was quiet for a moment. Eddie had a golden retriever, Buster. That dog was with him everywhere for 11 years. Eddie welded a sidecar onto his Road King so Buster could ride with him. When Eddie got sick and came home to the hospital bed, we set up in the living room. Buster slept on the floor beside him every night from diagnosis to the end. Rex's jaw shifted. When Gage brought your dog up out of that ravine and we got a clear look at him, I thought about Buster. And I thought about Eddie. And I understood that walking away from that animal and leaving him to finish dying down in the dirt was something that would have consequences for me that I was not willing to accept. The room was very still. Outside, a nightbird called once and went silent. That's the answer, Rex said. Loretta sat on her living room floor with her dog's head in her lap and looked at the large and scarred and complicated man standing in her house and felt the particular dislocation of realizing that the shape of what you have been afraid of is not identical to what the fear was actually about, and that the world contains more human interior than the surface of it suggests. I'm sorry about Eddie, she said. I am genuinely sorry about the bike. I understand now what I took from you, and I'm sorry for it. Rex nodded once. It was small and complete. Rex, she said. He waited. I need to tell you something that has been sitting with me since this afternoon, about where Banjo was. She reached for her phone on the cushion beside her and opened the Maps application. The screen showed the pins she had dropped over the past 3 days. B last seen. Ravine check here. She turned the screen toward him. I went into those woods yesterday afternoon. I had the location marked from the first night, the spot where I watched him run in, and I couldn't continue to sit in this house without doing something active. She looked at the screen and then at Rex. I found the ravine. I stood at the edge and looked down into it. I could see the fencing and the blackberry at the bottom, but I couldn't get down alone without rope and anchor equipment, and I was losing the light. She held the phone steady. I marked the GPS coordinates. I took photographs of the location from multiple angles. I marked a trail back to the road so I could find it quickly. I was going to come back today with rope. Rex looked at the phone screen. He looked at it for several seconds. Show me the ravine pin, he said. She held the screen so he could read the coordinates. Something moved across his face. A recalibration, quiet and significant. That's within 50 yards of where we found him, Rex said. I know, I understood that when you described the location. Rex handed the phone back. He stood looking at her in a way that was different from the ways he had looked at her before, attentive and direct, and without any of the layered wariness that had characterized every previous exchange. You were going back in alone, he said. It was not entirely a question. Yes, with whatever rope you could find, whatever I could manage. That ravine has 40 feet of drop and walls that don't hold, Rex said. A person without proper technique and anchoring equipment goes down there, and there's a real possibility they don't come up. I'm aware of that. But you were going regardless. Without him, I don't know what I'm holding on to, Loretta said. That's the honest truth of it, and it was true on day one, and it's true right now. The words settled into the room with the same plainness and weight they had carried in the gravel lot 4 days ago. Rex heard them the same way this time, with the full attention of a man who has just been shown something he had not expected to see. He did not say anything for a moment. Gage, he said without turning. Are we finished? Finished, Gage said. He was closing the kit latches with methodical care. Give the lady some room. Rex looked at Cutter and at the 2 other men who had drifted in from the porch at some point. They received the message without needing it spoken and began moving toward the front door. Loretta got to her feet. Rex, he turned. The debt, she said. The $10,000. I want you to have the honest version of where I stand because you've given me that courtesy tonight and I think I owe it back. I don't have it. I have $43 and I'm 30 days from losing this house. I will give you $100 every month for as long as it takes. I am not going to pretend the obligation doesn't exist." Rex Dolan looked at her for a long time. The scar along his jaw was pale in her interior light, and his gray eyes held something complex enough that she could not have cataloged all its components. "I'll speak to you about that," he said. "Give me 1 minute." He went out the front door and down the porch steps. She watched from the entryway as he moved through his men, speaking in a low and continuous murmur, and the men around him listened with the full attention that authority which is genuinely earned receives without demanding it. She could not hear his words. She watched cigarettes come up and get dropped and heel ground into the grass. She watched the men move toward their machines with an unhurried and practiced efficiency mounting up. And one by one, the engines turned over in the settled dark, each one finding its particular voice, layering into the combined sound until it was a single living vibration against the walls and windows of her house. Rex came back up the walk alone. He stopped at the base of the porch steps, which put him at slightly less than eye level with Loretta, where she stood in the doorway, and she did not think he was unaware of the choice. "Two things," he said. He reached into the inside pocket of his leather vest and brought out something small enough to hold between his thumb and forefinger. In the porch light, she could see it was a key on a short length of worn leather cord, old-fashioned, the kind that opened a padlock or a strongbox. On the key itself, scratched with something like a nail, were two initials, ED. "This came out of the tool compartment under the seat when the bike went over," Rex said. He turned it once between his fingers. "Key to Eddie's shop lockbox. The box is at the clubhouse. Everything else on that bike, the tank, the chrome work, the forks, the seat is gone. But this was lying on the gravel 10 feet from the wreck when I walked over to look, and I picked it up before I picked up anything else." He held it toward her. Eddie would have had a specific kind of regard for a woman who marks GPS coordinates before she walks into a forest alone to get her dog out of a ravine. He respected people who do what's necessary without waiting for the situation to improve first. "I want you to have this." Loretta looked at the key. She looked at Rex Dolan's face. "Why?" she said. "Because holding on to it serves me nothing," Rex said. "And I believe he would want it to go somewhere it carried weight." A pause. "Take it." She came down the porch steps and took the key from his hand. It was small and cold from his vest pocket. "The second thing," Rex said, "the debt." He looked at her steadily. "It's forgiven. Consider it settled. The dog's 3 days in that ravine and what it took to get him out covered it in whatever accounting system I'm running." He paused. "Take the $100 a month and buy him something good. He's more than earned it." Loretta looked at him for a moment without speaking. "Thank you," she said then, and because it needed to be said with full weight and not passed over, for Banjo. For 3 hours on a 40-foot drop with bolt cutters for a dog that had no claim on any of you. Thank you for that." Rex held her gaze. "Don't thank me for what Eddie told me to do," he said. He turned and walked down the front walk to the street. He mounted the black bagger at the head of the formation, the machine that had stood beside the candy apple red chopper in the lot that Tuesday afternoon and had survived the domino intact, and he settled into the seat and put his hands on the bars and sat for a moment looking at the street ahead. Loretta was already turning back toward the house. She had a dog to tend to. She had water to bring and a blanket to spread on the floor, and wounds to check, and an animal who needed her close. She had 30 days and $43 and a key with two initials in her hand that was already beginning to warm from her skin. She went inside. Behind her on Elm Street, 20 engines rose into formation, two columns finding their order in the dark, and the Iron Wolves moved south toward the highway in the same deliberate procession they had arrived in. Their taillights burned red in the July dark for a moment, and then they turned at the end of the block, and the sound of them diminished by degrees until it was gone, and Elm Street was quiet and ordinary again, as though nothing had come through it, as though the evening had been unremarkable. She did not sleep that night, but the hours passed differently than they had before. The previous 4 nights had been vigils, the body coiled and waiting for the sound that would mean the waiting was over and something worse had begun. This night she sat on the floor beside Banjo, with her back against the sofa cushions and her hand resting on his side, feeling each breath as it came and as it went, and the wakefulness was something she did not need to fight. It was the wakefulness of a person who is no longer waiting for anything to happen and has simply stayed up to be present for what is already here. He was warm. His nose, when she touched it at intervals through the night, was cool and slightly damp, which Gage had told her was a better sign than dry. The suture line along his foreleg was clean, and the bandaging around his shoulder was holding. She refilled his water bowl twice in the dark hours, and he drank both times with a deliberateness that suggested he had developed a new relationship with water over the past 3 days, a respect for it that he had not had before. Sometime in the hour before the sky began to lighten, she fell asleep sitting up with her hand on his back. And when the morning came in through the curtains she had not closed, she woke to find Banjo already awake, watching her face with the steady and patient attention of a dog who has decided that the most important ongoing project in his life is this particular sleeping person and is content to wait. She made coffee. She carried it to the front window. She pulled the curtain back and stood looking at Elm Street in the early morning light. The street was itself again. A neighbor 2 doors down running a sprinkler that arced in slow turns across his front lawn. A woman with a small terrier on a red leash moving along the sidewalk at the pace of the dog rather than her own. The flat white quality of July morning light on California asphalt. Everything ordinary and unhurried and indifferent to what had moved through here the previous evening, the way places always are in the morning after whatever happened. She stood at the window with her coffee, and she looked at her street, and she let the ordinariness of it land. Then she went to the kitchen and pulled the legal pad from the drawer beside the stove, and she sat down at the table and she made a list. It was not an optimistic list. It was an honest one, which is a different and more durable thing. She wrote down what she had, what she owed, and what actions were available to her. She wrote for 40 minutes with her coffee going cold. And when she was finished, she looked at what the list said, and she looked out the window at the sprinkler arc in her neighbor's yard, and she thought with the particular clarity that arrives after sustained stress has finally broken and left the mind temporarily clean and uncluttered, that the situation in front of her was very difficult and was not impossible, and that the distance between those two things was the only territory that mattered. Banjo shifted on his blanket in the corner and exhaled the long and boneless exhalation of an animal that has completed its reassessment and found the current arrangement of things acceptable. She looked at him. He looked at her. His tail moved once. "Okay," she said aloud to the kitchen, to herself, to the general situation. "Okay." She spent the morning on the phone. She called the Kern County Housing Assistance Office, which she had been avoiding because asking for institutional help was something she had been trained by experience to experience as a form of personal failure. And she made that call first specifically because it was the one she was most inclined to postpone. She called a legal aid organization in Bakersfield that handled housing cases on a sliding scale fee. She called Patricia Voss, a woman she had worked alongside for 6 years before Patricia moved to the county records office. A woman who knew the administrative landscape of Kern County, the way some people know the streets of their childhood neighborhood. And Patricia said, without requiring much explanation, "Give me until Thursday and I'll see what's moving." She called the veterinary clinic on Mesquite Street and described Banjo's injuries and the treatment he had received. And the veterinarian who took her call said the suture work sounded correctly done and the penicillin appropriate, and that she should bring him in within 2 days, but that based on the description, he was likely past the immediate danger. When she set the phone down after the last call, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table, and she let herself feel without ceremony, and without making too much of it, the quality of a morning that was hard and moving at the same time. She made a second cup of coffee, and she called Sheriff Maddox. He picked up on the second ring. "Maddox? It's Loretta Haynes. I wanted to give you an update on the Iron Wolves situation." A pause that contained attention. "What kind of update?" "They came to my house last night." She heard him draw breath and she kept going before he could respond. It wasn't what either of us anticipated. They found Banjo in a ravine off the logging road on the East Ridge. They brought him home. Rex Dolan has forgiven the debt entirely. A longer pause. Loretta, Rex Dolan forgave a $10,000 debt. Yes. I've been running this department for 28 years, Maddox said slowly in the manner of a man checking the structural integrity of a sentence before he commits to it. That is not behavior I have previous experience with from the Iron Wolves. No, she said. I don't imagine it is. She could hear him reconfiguring something, the sound of a mental picture being disassembled and rebuilt with new information. Are you all right? I am, she said. Banjo needs a veterinary assessment and I need a housing attorney, and I have 27 days left on the foreclosure notice. But I am all right. The housing attorney, he said, and his voice had shifted back into the register of practical assistance. There's a woman named Helen Marsh who practices out of an office on Spruce Street. She does housing cases and she works on sliding scale. Tell her I referred you. Thank you, Dale. Loretta, he paused. I'm glad it came out the way it did. So am I, she said. She put the phone down and looked at the key on the table where she had placed it when she made her first cup of coffee. Then she picked it up and slid it into the pocket of her jeans, and she was aware of it there for the rest of the day, the way you are aware of something that has been given to you by someone who understood exactly what they were handing over. 3 days later, she carried Banjo to the car and drove him to the veterinary clinic. He accepted being carried with the composed dignity of a dog who has made peace with temporary indignities, and he rode in the passenger seat with his chin on the console in his preferred position, and she drove with one hand on the wheel and one hand on his back. The veterinarian, a compact and precise woman in her mid-50s named Dr. Aldous, who wore her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and who examined patients with the quality of attention usually associated with people who genuinely enjoy their work, looked at the suture line on Banjo's foreleg for a long time without comment. She ran her fingers along it in both directions. She examined the shoulder wound with the same quiet thoroughness. She pressed along the injured leg at intervals, watching Banjo's face rather than her own hands. Then she looked at Loretta. Who did this suture work? Dr. Aldous said. A man named Gage, Loretta said. Dr. Aldous turned back to the leg. She looked at the sutures again with the evaluative focus of someone who knows exactly what good work looks like because they have done a great deal of it. The tension is correct and the spacing is even. The technique is sound. This is competent field work. Tell Gage he did well. She continued her examination. The shoulder wound is healing cleanly. The penicillin was the right choice and the dosage was appropriate. There's no sign of deep tissue damage in the paw injury, though he'll need to rebuild strength in that leg over the next several weeks. She looked at Loretta over the top of the chartboard she was making notes on. He is going to be completely fine. He lost significant weight and condition, and he will need time to recover his strength, but there is no lasting damage that I can find. She looked at Banjo again. He is a remarkably tough animal. Yes, Loretta said, he is. She drove home with the windows down and Banjo's ears streaming back in the warm, moving air. His eyes squinted in the particular expression of a dog receiving exactly what it wants from the moment and having no reservations about receiving it. She thought about toughness, whether it was something a person or an animal possessed independently of circumstance, or whether it was something that circumstance revealed something always present but only visible under specific conditions. She thought about Banjo in the ravine for 3 days, managing the arithmetic of survival, and she thought that perhaps the distinction didn't matter much. You had it or you found out you had it, and either way you had it. On the following Monday, she sat across a desk from Helen Marsh, who was 63 years old and wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and had the efficient, unsentimental focus of someone who has spent decades solving problems that had already beaten everyone else who looked at them. Helen looked at the foreclosure notice and asked 7 specific questions in sequence, making a note after each answer, and then she set her pen down and looked at Loretta directly. There are 2 routes worth pursuing here, Helen said. The first involves a state-level hardship provision that your bank was required to disclose during the loan modification process, and based on what you've described, almost certainly did not disclose in the legally required manner. The second involves Kern County's Emergency Housing Preservation Fund, which received a new allocation in the spring legislative session and has not yet been fully distributed. She paused. I cannot guarantee the house, but I can tell you with certainty that this situation has more room in it than that notice makes it appear. Loretta paid the consultation fee in exact cash from the last of the reserve she had been maintaining in a kitchen drawer envelope. She shook Helen Marsh's hand and walked out onto Spruce Street and stood on the sidewalk in the late morning heat and looked at the ordinary business of a small California city going about its Tuesday, and she felt without drama and without forcing it that she was going to find her way through this. Not easily, not quickly, but through it. It was not certainty. Certainty was always provisional and subject to what happened next. What she felt was something more structural than certainty, the knowledge freshly earned and specific to recent experience that she was capable of remaining functional and purposeful under conditions that would have seemed from a distance unsurvivable, and that this capability was hers and did not depend on circumstances being cooperative. She drove home. 2 weeks passed. Banjo healed with the uncomplicated speed of a young animal that has no philosophical reservations about recovery. By the end of the first week, he was putting cautious weight on the injured leg, testing it with the careful deliberateness of someone checking ice before committing to it. By the end of the second week, he was crossing the backyard at something close to his normal gait. Though he still favored the leg on turns, and Loretta still watched him from the back step, with an attention that she knew was probably excessive and that she had no intention of reducing. She went back to the Ravine on a Saturday morning, in the third week alone, in the early morning before the heat came up. She parked at the trailhead and walked in along the path she had marked with broken branches, and she found the ravine and stood at its edge and looked down at the bleached creek rocks and the rusted wire and the blackberry canes at the specific place where Banjo had been when she stood at this edge 3 weeks ago and called his name into the quiet and heard nothing. She stood there for a while without trying to think anything particular, just looking at the place, acknowledging it. Then she turned around and walked back out to the road. Some things need to be visited once and then left where they are. On a Tuesday morning in the third week, her phone showed a call from a number she did not have saved. Ms. Haynes. Rex Dolan's voice was not one she was going to forget or fail to recognize. It had a texture and a weight that were entirely specific to him. "Rex," she said, "how are you?" "I'm calling with some information I thought you'd want," he said. He had the diction of a man who has chosen his words before making the call and is delivering them in the order he selected. "About the bikes from the accident." "All right. The two machines that went down in the chain reaction, the bagger and the touring bike, have both been fully assessed. The damage was significant but restorable. Parts are on order, and both bikes will be back to their owners within the month." A pause that had weight. Eddie's chopper is a different situation. Loretta leaned against the kitchen counter and waited. The frame is bent beyond straightening. The tank is destroyed. The custom chrome fabrication on that bike was done entirely by Eddie's hands, and Eddie is not available to reproduce it, and no one else living who I know of could reproduce it either. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet she could hear him deciding something or confirming a decision already made. "I've been sitting with the question of what to do with what's left of it for 3 weeks. I made a decision yesterday." "What decision?" "I'm going to rebuild it from the frame out," Rex said. "Not restore what existed. Build something new that starts from what's left and goes forward from there. It's going to take a few years, and what comes out of it won't be the same machine." He paused. "I've been thinking about what Eddie would actually prefer, given the choice between me carrying the loss of the original for the rest of my life, or me building a second one out of the loss of the first." He wasn't a man who valued preservation over creation. He built the first one from nothing. He would not have had a problem with there being a second one built from what the first one left behind. Loretta stood in her kitchen with the phone against her ear and felt the specific quality of watching someone arrive at a conclusion that has cost them something genuine and real to reach the quality of a decision that has been weighed honestly and accepted fully. That sounds exactly right, she said. I thought so too, Rex said. There's one more thing. Daryl Pruitt's bike was recovered last week. The people who took it moved their operation north, as people in that business tend to do when they think they've been identified, but they weren't careful enough about the move. The bike came back intact. I'm glad for him. The reason I'm telling you, Rex said, is that in the course of recovering Daryl's bike, we developed information that connected the same individuals to two other vehicle thefts in the area, including a truck taken from a family over in Kernville, a family with young children who needed that truck for work. We passed the location information to a contact in the sheriff's department. A pause. The family in Kernville got their truck back. Loretta understood what he was giving her with that piece of information and why he was giving it, which was a more complete picture of the world in which the Iron Wolves operated than the one she had constructed from the outside. It was not a simple picture. It was not a picture that absolved anything, but it was more complete. Rex, she said, can I ask you something? You can ask. That first day, at the gas station, when I told you I didn't have the money and you told me to move my vehicle. She paused, organizing the question. Did you know then that you weren't actually going to hurt me? The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a man giving a question the honesty it deserves. I knew I was angry enough to want to, Rex said, and I knew that wanting something and doing it are not the same action and that I was not going to do it. Another pause. But I was not in a position at the gas station to be transparent about any of that. The situation required a different presentation. He was quiet for a moment. Cutter will have mentioned that I spent the better part of 2 days actively talking certain members out of escalating the situation in ways I had not authorized. He did mention something along those lines. Cutter talks more than is generally useful, Rex said without any particular heat in it. But he's not wrong. Loretta looked out the back window. Banjo was in the yard, lying in the shade of the single oak near the back fence. His repaired leg extended his eyes at half-mast in the manner of an animal with no objection to the current moment. She had let him out half an hour ago and would call him in before the full afternoon heat arrived. One more question, she said. Go ahead. The key, she said. She touched it where it sat on the kitchen windowsill, where she had placed it that morning to catch the light. Eddie's key. You told me he would have wanted it to go somewhere it meant something. I want to know if there's something I can do with it. Not return it. I understand the logic of why you gave it away. But something that earns it. Something that connects to what it came from. Rex was quiet in a different way than his previous silences. This one had the quality of something being decided carefully. Eddie did something, Rex said. Informal, unofficial. When he found a dog that was lost or injured, he took it in. Sometimes he placed them with people he knew. Sometimes he kept them. He had a feeling about animals that were fighting to get back to something. He thought they deserved help getting there. He paused. It wasn't a program or an organization. It was just something he did because it needed doing, and he was positioned to do it. I see, Loretta said. The key doesn't carry an obligation, Rex said. I told you why I gave it to you, and that stands on its own. But if you're asking what Eddie would have found fitting. He let the sentence stop where it stopped without completing it because it was already complete. I understand, Loretta said. She stood in the kitchen after the call ended, holding the phone, and then she put it down and went to the back door and called Banjo in from the yard. He came at his new and careful gait across the dry grass, unhurried and certain of his welcome, and she held the screen door, and he went past her into the cool of the house and settled onto his blanket in the kitchen corner with the ease of an animal that has completed its recovery and is now simply living. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with the legal pad and wrote a different kind of list than the one she had written the morning after the Iron Wolves left. This one was shorter and less structured. It was a list of directions rather than a plan, because plans require stable conditions and directions require only the person who holds them. She looked at it when she was done. She set Eddie's key on top of it. Through the window, the California summer evening was making its slow transition from white to gold to the beginning of amber, and the neighborhood was offering its evening sounds, the sprinklers and the screen doors, and the occasional car on the street, and the distant diminishing sound of a truck on the highway. She had 21 days remaining on the foreclosure notice. And Helen Marsh had called that afternoon to say the hardship provision filing had been submitted to the bank and that a legally required response had to arrive within 15 business days, which put it at the edge of the deadline, but inside it, which was where it needed to be. Two follow-up calls about the county housing fund were scheduled for the week ahead. She had a second interview the following Thursday with the county administrative office for a records management position, a role that used exactly the skills she had built over 9 years as a court clerk, and she intended to walk into that interview prepared in a way she had not been prepared for an interview since the early years of her career, when she had still understood what it meant to need something badly enough to work for it without reservation. The ground under her feet was not solid, but it was ground that could become solid, and that was not where she had been a month ago when the ground had been actively giving way beneath her weight. Banjo came to the kitchen, which was his evening routine, and settled himself beside her chair and put his chin on her foot. She looked down at him. He looked up at her with the brown eyes that had found her through the denim wrapping on her porch and confirmed that he knew exactly where he was. The suture line on his leg was already fading, the fur growing in soft and new over the scar and the patient and thorough way of living things that do not need to be reminded to heal. She thought about Rex Dolan somewhere south of Ridgecrest, in whatever space the iron wolves used for their mechanical work standing over a bent frame, and the scattered remnants of something his brother had made in committing to the work of building rather than the work of mourning. She thought about a man named Eddie Dolan who had welded a sidecar onto his motorcycle so a golden retriever could ride with him through 11 years of California roads and California weather. She thought about Cutter dropping a piece of chrome on her welcome mat at 11 o'clock on a dark night and bolting at the sound of a neighbor's dog producing 4 days of psychological warfare out of pure clumsiness, which was when she held it at the right distance and in the right light, one of the more genuinely absurd things she had been part of in her life. She thought about what it meant to be surprised by people. She had believed with the confidence that comes from having been burned in specific and instructive ways that she had arrived at an accurate working understanding of what the world was made of and what it reliably produced. She had organized her expectations around that understanding. And then a single month had unfolded in ways that her understanding had no category for, and here she was on the other side of it, with a key on her legal pad and a dog on her foot and a clearer view of things than she had possessed in years. The view was not simple. Rex Dolan was not uncomplicated. The Iron Wolves operated in ways that produced real damage in real communities, and that damage was not canceled out or excused by what they had done for her, and she was not going to arrange her thinking to make it seem otherwise. She held both things at the same time and did not try to force them into a single shape, because the world does not have a single shape. And the capacity to hold two true things simultaneously without requiring them to resolve into one was something she intended to keep exercising. What she knew was this, that she had been genuinely afraid, and that the fear had been warranted because the threat was real. And she knew that the real threat had transformed through a chain of events that included a piece of chrome dropped by an inattentive biker, a dog's refusal to stop fighting in the bottom of a ravine, a dead man's golden retriever, and a living man's private and continuing grief into the closest thing to a miracle she had personally witnessed. And she knew that miracles in her experience did not announce themselves in advance. They arrived through the specific and unglamorous channels that happened to be available, and you did not get to choose the channels. She put her hand on Banjo's head. He made the sound low in his chest, the sound that meant he had assessed the current situation and found it satisfactory on all relevant dimensions. She kept her hand there. Outside, the last of the light was going. The kitchen moved toward blue. She reached across the table and picked up her phone and found the number for the Kern County Animal Shelter in Kernville, which she had looked up that morning after seeing the posting on the grocery store community board. A German Shepherd mix. found on the shoulder of the highway. Thin, frightened, no identification. The shelter had noted 5 days when they posted it. The posting was now 2 days old. The shelter line rang twice. Kern Valley Animal Services, this is Sandra. Hi, Loretta said. My name is Loretta Haynes. I'm calling about the German Shepherd mix you posted 2 days ago, the one found on the highway. Yes, we have him. He's still here. Good, Loretta said. I'd like to come see him. I can be there tomorrow morning if that works. She made the appointment and put the phone down. She looked at Eddie's key on the legal pad. She picked it up and held it in her palm and felt the small and specific weight of it, the warmth it had gathered from the table, and the evening light through the window. Outside, the California night was finishing its arrival, the sky completing itself above the rooftops of Elm Street, in the particular deep blue that comes just after the last color drains out of the west. And the neighborhood had gone to its evening quiet. And somewhere south on Highway 395, a truck was heading toward Bakersfield with its headlights on, and the ordinary world was doing what it always did, continuing. She closed her hand around the key. She would go see the dog in the morning. She would make the next call and the call after that. She would walk into the interview on Thursday, and she would be prepared in a way that left no room for doubt. She would sit across from Helen Marsh as many times as it took. She would do what was necessary without waiting for the conditions to improve, because the conditions did not tend to improve on their own, and because that was the only approach she had any evidence actually worked. Banjo shifted against her foot, resettling himself, and exhaled with the long and unhurried contentment of a creature who has returned from somewhere very far away and found everything where he left it. She sat in her kitchen in the blue evening dark, the key warm in her closed hand, the dog warm and solid and real against her foot, and she did not turn on the light for a while longer. There was enough to see by. There was enough.